Hey designers! Welcome back to another video where we break down professional design techniques into actionable tips you can apply today. In this tutorial, we're diving into one of the most underrated aspects of great web design: layout and spacing. These are the silent workhorses that make the difference between amateur and professional-looking interfaces. If you've ever struggled with designs that just don't feel professional enough, these techniques will transform your approach. Let's get started. Number 1. Start with too much white space. One of the easiest ways to clean up a design is to simply give every element a little more room to breathe. Sounds simple enough, right? So how come we don't usually do it? White space should be removed, not added. When designing for the web, white space is almost always added to a design. If something looks too cramped, you add a bit of margin or padding until things look better. The problem with this approach is that elements are only given the minimum amount of breathing room necessary to not look actively bad. To make something actually look great, you usually need more white space. A better approach is to start by giving something way too much space, then remove it until you're happy with the result. You might think you'd end up with too much white space this way, but in practice, what might seem like a little too much when focused on an individual element ends up being closer to just enough in the context of a complete UI. Number 2. Establishing a spacing and sizing system. You shouldn't be nitpicking between 120 pixels and 125 pixels when trying to decide on the perfect size for an element in your UI. Painfully trialing arbitrary values 1 pixel at a time will drastically slow you down at best and create ugly, inconsistent designs at worst. Instead, limit yourself to a constrained set of values defined in advance. A linear scale won't work. Creating a spacing and sizing system isn't quite as simple as something like make sure everything is a multiple of 4 pixels. A naive approach like that doesn't make it any easier to choose between 120 pixels and 125 pixels. For a system to be truly useful, it needs to take into consideration their relative difference between adjacent values. At the small end of the scale, like the size of an icon or the padding inside of a button, a couple of pixels can make a big difference. Jumping from 12 pixels to 16 pixels is an increase of 33%. But at the large end, the width of a card or the vertical spacing in a landing page hero, a couple of pixels is basically imperceivable. Even increasing the width of a card from 500 pixels to 520 pixels is only a difference of 4%, which is 8 times less significant than a jump from 12 pixels to 16 pixels. If you want your system to make sizing decisions easy, make sure no two values in your scale are ever closer than about 25%. Defining the system. Just like you don't want to toil over arbitrary values when sizing an element or fine-tuning the space between elements, you don't want to build your spacing and sizing scale from arbitrary values either. A simple approach is to start with a sensible base value, then build a scale using factors and multiples of that value. 16 pixels is a great number to start with because it divides nicely, and also happens to be the default font size in every major web browser. The values at the small end of the scale should start pretty packed together, and get progressively more spaced apart as you get further up the scale. Here's an example of a fairly practical scale built using this approach. Using the system. Once you've defined your spacing and sizing system, you'll find that you're able to design a hell lot faster, especially if you design in the browser. Sticking to a system is easier when you're typing in numbers than when you're dragging with the mouse. Need to add some space under an element? Grab a value from your scale and try it out. Not quite enough? The next value is probably perfect. While the workflow improvements are probably the biggest benefit, you'll also start to notice a subtle consistency in your designs that wasn't there before, and things will look just a little bit cleaner. A spacing and sizing system will help you create better designs, with less effort and less time. Design advice doesn't get much more valuable than that. Number 3, you don't have to fill the whole screen. Remember when 960 pixels was the de facto layout width for desktop-sized designs? These days, you'd be hard-pressed to find a phone with a resolution that low. So it's no surprise that when most of us open our design tool of choice on our high-resolution displays, we give ourselves at least 1,200 to 1,400 pixels of space to fill. But just because you have the space doesn't mean you need to use it. If you only need 600 pixels, use 600 pixels. Spreading things out or making things unnecessarily wide just makes an interface harder to interpret. While a little extra space around the edges never hurt anyone. This is just as applicable to individual sections of an interface too. You don't need to make everything full width just because something else, like your navigation, is full width. Give each element just the space it needs. Don't make something worse just to make it match something else. Number 4. Grids are overrated. Using a system like a 12-column grid is a great way to simplify layout decisions and can bring a satisfying sense of order to your designs, but even though grids can be useful, outsourcing all your layout decisions to a grid can do more harm than good. Fundamentally, a grid system is just about giving elements fluid, percentage-based widths, where you're choosing from a constrained set of percentages. For example, in a 12-column grid, each column is 8.33% wide. As long as an element's width is some multiple of 8.33%, including any gutters, that element is on the grid. The problem with treating grid systems like a religion is that there are a lot of situations where it makes much more sense for an element to have a fixed width instead of a relative width. For example, consider a traditional sidebar layout. Using a 12-column grid system, you might give the sidebar a width of 3 columns, 25%, and the main content area a width of 9 columns, 75%. This might seem fine at first, but think about what happens when you resize the screen. If you make the screen wider, the sidebar gets wider too, taking up space that could have been put to better use by the main content area. Similarly, if you make the screen narrower, the sidebar can shrink below its minimum reasonable width, causing awkward text wrapping or truncation. In this situation, it makes much more sense to give the sidebar a fixed width that's optimized for its content. The main content area can then flex to fill the remaining space, using its own internal grid to lay out its children. This applies within components too. Don't use percentages to size something unless you actually want it to scale. Number 5. Relative sizing doesn't scale. It's tempting to believe that every part of an interface should be sized relative to one another, and that if element A needs to shrink by 25% on smaller screens, that element B should shrink by 25% too. For example, say you're designing an article at a large screen size. If your body copy is 18 pixels and your headlines are 45 pixels, it's tempting to encode that relationship by defining your headline size as 2.5 em, 2.5 times the current font size. There's nothing inherently wrong with using relative units like this. But don't be fooled into believing that relationships defined this way can remain static. 2.5 em might be the perfect headline size on desktop, but there's no guarantee that it'll be the right size on smaller screens. Say you reduce the size of your body copy to 14 pixels on small screens to keep the line length in check. Keeping your headlines at 2.5 em means a rendered font size of 35 pixels, way too big for a small screen. A better headline size for small screens might be somewhere between 20 pixels and 24 pixels. That's only 1.5 to 1.7 times the size of the 14-pixel body copy, a totally different relationship than what made sense on desktop screens. That means that there isn't any real relationship at all, and that there's no real benefit in trying to define the headline size relative to the body copy size. As a general rule, elements that are large on large screens need to shrink faster than elements that are already fairly small. The difference between small elements and large elements should be less extreme at small screen sizes. As we wrap up today's video, remember that mastering layout and spacing isn't just about following rules. It's about developing an eye for balance and hierarchy. Implementing these 5 principles will immediately elevate your designs and help them feel more professional, balanced, and intentional. If you found this video helpful or would like to know more about the services that NDEF provide, please click on the link below to contact us for a free call. Thank you.